Hi everybody and welcome. And in this week's video, I am here chatting with Paula Rastrick. Now, Paula is somebody that I've known for a little while. We met through Instagram, actually, as you do, and we both have quite similar views on menopause and the use of HRT, etc. Now, let's get started and let's have a chat with Paula on this really important topic. So, hi, Paula.
Hi there, thank you for having me.
So let's start off. If you could just tell viewers a bit about yourself.
Yeah, so my story began back in 2017 when I was 45, just turned 45, and I was in the middle of a very stressful period in my life and lots of things going on personally. And one of my friends said to me, "Oh, you might be perimenopausal." And in 2017, this was before menopause was what I call mainstream. And at the time, I just said, look, I need something to help me to keep going because we'd started a new business, myself and my husband. It was a very stressful time. So I was prescribed HRT by a private menopause specialist, and I was put on a starting dose of 100 mcl, which is like the highest licensed estrogen patch. I think that would make sense to people, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
And I was then put on progesterone as well, but I was only put on cyclical progesterone. So basically, a long story short, my estrogen dose, the ratio of estrogen to progesterone wasn't correct, but I didn't know that at the time. So off I went and started to have side effects. And because I was having side effects, I didn't realize, because of the mess that my life was in at the time, I didn't realize that this was side effects. I just thought it was just more stress. So I didn't attribute anything to the hormone replacement therapy because I knew nothing about it. So after 3 months, I wasn't feeling great at all. And I went back. And at this point, my estrogen dose was doubled. So my estrogen dose was doubled. So that put me on 200, which is a high dose. And the progesterone stayed the same. And the kind of long and short of that story is things started to get really, really bad. And it happened over a long period of time. So I'll try to condense it. I was also prescribed testosterone, and things just started to unravel. Mentally, my mental health started to unravel on top of all of the issues that were happening at the time. And then eventually I started to bleed. And then eventually I started to flood. And then eventually things just reached a really dramatic kind of head, really. So I still did not attribute it to the HRT at the time until I was in real trouble. And then my doctor said to me, I went to see my doctor. They didn't know I was on the higher dose of HRT, and because the medical notes were sent to the wrong doctor, so they had no idea. So basically they said to me, you need to come off this HRT. So then they said you'll need to get checked for wound cancer. And then, so it was just this horrible mess of not understanding what was going on, ending up having to have hysteroscopy. And because of my background, I've got a complex trauma background. Unfortunately, that triggered PTSD. And then that added to the whole, the whole mess. And so the best way to describe it was a very long, slow, and then a dramatic crash. Which ended up in it wasn't a very pleasant experience and had a big massive effect on my family. So that was kind of the long and short of it. And then when I started to recover, they had to bring me off the estrogen dose slowly. To be fair, I stayed on HRT. So once I kind of got myself down and they gave me antidepressants, and I was just a mess, you know. Anyway, long and short of it is then COVID came along and I closed my business and I came off down on the HRT, I came off the antidepressants, and then that is when I started thinking something wasn't right. Something happened there that doesn't make sense. And all the way along, I've been told by gynecologists, your estrogen dose was too high, your progesterone dose was too low, and you're in it, so you can't work it out. And then I started to investigate. That's the best way to put it. I started to look at, why did I have such a traumatic time, and was that to do with the estrogen dose? Because that's what all the medics had told me. And that kind of then started the process for me of starting to research and go backwards and starting to join the dots in my own history. And I've written a book. So I've written an evidence-based book. It's taken quite a few years to kind of draw together, because I wanted to really understand somebody of my profile. You know, I'm saying ADHD. I think complex trauma, from what the research I've done, ADHD, highly sensitive people, autism, they're all crossing over. They're all, when you start to look at it from the womb. So somebody of my profile, I would suggest, has a more sensitive nervous system. And that's kind of where I'm sort of at now.
Yeah, yeah. And tell us a little bit about what you do now.
So yeah, over the last few years, I gave up work over a year ago now. I've just done a postgrad in psychological trauma, and I'm now currently doing my EMDR training. So, and over the years since COVID, I've just been moving into more of the sort of trauma sort of world. Previously to that, I was very much involved in pain science. So the brain and the nervous system's always been my thing. It's just then I've kind of transferred that learning from about the brain and pain, and now I've started to add in more about the nervous system and how your nervous system is shaped from your early years, and how that affects your neurotransmitters, and then how that affects your hormone profile, and then just joining all of these dots up and looking at ADHD, because there's a lot of women being diagnosed now with ADHD in midlife, and why is that, and sort of all this sort of complex kind of brain and nervous system sort of stuff, but really based on the fact that I started looking at the science of why some women PMDD, there's cross links with PMDD, which is cross linked with ADHD, and then PMS, and I started to think, you know, it's not as simple as this current sort of model of menopause, which I think is very HRT dominated, which is very much based on, you know, hormone deficiency and estrogen deficiency. And I fundamentally, from the work that I've done, that's how I was treated as a patient. And fundamentally, from the work that I've done, it's just so oversimplified. It's scary, because women are almost being led into this path of thinking that hormone replacement is going to fix, you know, all of everything. And then when it doesn't, because I mean, I'm not saying that HRT doesn't work. I'm saying that there's a lot more women out there having side effects and not being able to get this right, because we've not understood in terms of essentially the brain and the nervous system is constantly evolving epigenetically. So it's like a moving target based on your psychosocial stresses as well. So it's a bit like I was given testosterone, for example, for low libido and brain fog and concentration. Well, I mean, my marriage was going down the pan at the time. I was in a high state of threat. I was running on adrenaline. And so if you give me more estrogen and testosterone, it's just going to convert to more excitatory energy. And it pushed my rage and my, do you see what I mean? It's like, it's not just as simple as, oh, here's a car engine, put some oil in it and off you go again, love, you know? And I think I'm just really passionate about trying to widen and broaden the conversations.
I couldn't agree more. And I see it day in, day out with the ladies that I speak to and the ones that I end up working with. And because I've been doing this for, you know, a number of years, I came into working with perimenopause before the menopause became such a massive thing in terms of, you know, the media interest in it and the explosion of the market, which we'll come on to. And so I've seen the sort of the change in terms of women knowing about HRT and being on HRT. You know, go back 5 years, there was a small percentage on HRT. Now it's a majority, although a lot of them are trying it and then coming off it because they're not given the right dose, or it's not suiting them, or it's the wrong type, or, you know, there's so many different things.
There is.
It is really, really interesting to see how it's kind of playing out. And I always said, when it kind of 2 years ago, during lockdowns, when it was being talked about by certain celebrities and as if it was the panacea to every woman's menopausal problem. And I said at the time, this is going to come back and bite people on the bum, because it's just not this simple. And what I think really lacked was, well, what's your body doing with that estrogen? How is it metabolizing that estrogen? Where's it going? I mean, you know, unless you do this work for a living and you're trained in it, you wouldn't understand necessarily that every hormone has to be metabolized, and that the liver plays the biggest role in this. And, you know, there's different pathways for metabolism. If you struggled with metabolizing estrogen when you were younger and you had symptoms like PMS or, you know, headaches or whatever, why is it that they suddenly, the doctors suddenly think that you can metabolize body identical estrogen or progesterone or testosterone? Like, you know, nothing's changed. Your body's still going to deal with it the same way. And that's what I think a lot of women discover later when they start to do this. But the consequences can be very severe for some people, as you say. And then there's the the growth, or as you said, a lot more women being, or people in general being diagnosed with this new term neurodivergent, which actually has suddenly again exploded. It was never talked about in that way before, and now it's a term that, like, there's neurodivergent coaches, and it's kind of like a growth area. But ultimately, it's people who are sensitive.
Yeah, I think it's always been there. So this is another
always
thing
been
about
there.
from, you know, it's always been there. It's just that we've not understood it, I suppose, in a way. But, you know, some of us do have, there's genetics, there's epigenetics, you know, there's multiple different theories, but I don't think it's a new thing. I think the explosion of it being a new thing is potentially that women are, especially with women in midlife, as they're coming to perimenopause, when there's this hormonal turbulence, and then it's getting all mixed up with lots of other things, you know. I mean, I think there's multiple things. And then obviously, you know, being diagnosed with ADHD like me, but when I've looked at the research and drawn it across from starting from the womb, it's entirely feasible that women are actually have their ratios of hormones. You can be actually higher in estrogen from womb, from fetal development. And I think this is what we've not understood, right? So again, it's a really good sort of what you're saying, because there's multiple things that can happen. But if you're higher in estrogen ratios, as in you're higher in glutamate, you're higher in excitatory hormones or neurotransmitters, and then, which is typically ADHD, autism, highly sensitive, complex trauma, and then you arrive at, say, perimenopause, like I did, you know, we have less inhibitory chemicals, which means our stress response is really delicate. You know, we've got a very narrow window of stress tolerance, but then I was treated with more estrogen, which actually doesn't make sense, because estrogen's spiking up to 3 times higher than it ever has been. I'm already probably higher in estrogen anyway. Again, very valid point that if you put estrogen in the system, and what happened to me, you don't know how well the receptors are dealing with that. You know, and there's this thing now where it's like, well, I need higher and higher doses. Well, I would be saying, look, you don't know what those receptors are doing, because receptors in the brain are really clever. That's the whole point. They will try and shut the system down to stop it from becoming inflamed, right? So if you're not absorbing, or you're not feeling the effects, it may be that your receptors have now become blocked, inactive. You know, we're dealing with the brain here. And I think to keep saying to people, which is what happens to me and a lot of other women, is like, keep taking more, keep taking more. I don't think that's a good pathway to go down, personally.
No. And that brings me on to my next question, which we've talked about it a little bit in the past, but as you know, with the work I do, my focus is on mineral balancing and heavy metals. And the correlation that I have seen over and over and over again, and is very well known in the mineral testing world that I work in, but perhaps is not necessarily looked at or discussed in enough detail in other disciplines,
Right.
is the effect, the correlation between copper and estrogen. And what we know is that copper and estrogen rise together. So your point about babies being born who are dominant in estrogen,
yeah, you can be higher
if
in
you
estrogen.
look into it, you'll also find very, very likely that they are excessively high in copper. And so it's like, which comes first?
Right.
Now, copper started so the body will hold on to copper, and copper will increase when there is an excess of estrogen. And when did this start happening? Started happening when the pill was introduced.
Right. Okay.
It doesn't have to be natural estrogen. It can be xenoestrogens, and it can be synthetic estrogens.
Right.
So when the pill was introduced in the 70s, we started to see this rise in copper. And what happened was, generationally, it went up and up and up. And it's passed in utero from mother to baby. And so now there are boys who are born copper toxic.
Right. Interesting.
And so we have this big correlation. And copper is one of the most excitatory metals. It's not a heavy metal, it's a light metal, but it is excitatory to the brain and gets stored in the brain. Now, the other thing to know is that if you have poor adrenal health, if your adrenals aren't strong, you cannot produce, you won't get the signal to produce something called ceruloplasmin, which transports copper. If the body can't transport copper, it can't get rid of it. It gets stored. Where does it get stored? In the liver and the brain.
Right.
And so there is this big correlation. And then you bring in the fact that almost every person that we see who has ADHD, who's diagnosed with ADHD, ADD, even autism, has very high buried levels of copper in the body.
It makes sense. It makes sense based on the research that I've done, although I don't know anything about copper in the way you do, but I've looked at it from a sort of EI balance, a sort of excitatory kind of EI balance. And there's definitely the research there to support that it is, you know, higher in excitatory, which, you know, without being scary, is higher inflammation. because, you know, and I just can't get my head around the fact that in perimenopause, you're not actually estrogen deficient. I mean, that doesn't even make sense either. So it's like,
we've had this conversation before, right? It's like,
what are you doing?
Why at the age of 45 are you not tested and you're just shoved on estrogen and progesterone? Like, you can be having some days where your estrogen is through the roof.
Yeah.
And then falling. So what happens on the days where you're taking loads of estrogen or putting it on your body and you are going through the roof? Well, you're going to have a crazy day, right? You're going to feel like...
Well, the thing is that loads of women, so this is one thing that, this is my own personal experience and women that I've spoken to. So one of the things that I'm trying to get across to people, because this happened to me, was if you take estrogen and your anxiety increases, which is really common, right? Then what's happening is women are told, oh, it's a perimenopause symptom, take more estrogen. No, it's the estrogen.
Or they get heart palpitations.
Yeah, it's the estrogen. It's a side effect. And yet they're being told, and this happened to me, no, take more estrogen. So now that people become very confused about, I don't know what's a side effect. I don't know what's going on. I've had women that have spoken to me that have been put on crazy doses. I mean, I was on 200. I've had women speak to me that have been put on 500. They've been, you know, 16 pumps of gel, one woman was on, right? 16 pumps of gel. I had psychiatric, put under psychiatric care, but they keep getting told, put more in. If your system is telling you, I'm running on too much excitatory energy, which is anxiety, fight, flight, which is your sympathetic arousal, and you're in hyper arousal, the last thing you want to do is put more estrogen in. And unfortunately, that's where I think there's some real errors being made, because women are almost being told, oh no, put more in because it's a perimenopause. It's not. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, you know, add to that the fact that there's a lot of crossover with symptoms of perimenopause and things like adrenal insufficiency and thyroid issues. Thyroid issues can get a lot worse.
That's what in my book I've said, you know, like, I mean, obviously I focused on it from my own background, but looking at the HPA axis, looking at the HPT axis, looking at the HPG axis, you can't separate any of these. Your gonadal hormones, your thyroid and your stress response, they cannot be separated biologically. And yet we just keep talking about one as if it's sitting there on its own, like this kind of estrogen pot that's like, you know, this chemical, this molecule is the most important. It's not even the master neurotransmitter in the brain. It's not even, you know, so it's like we've been kind of led down this path of, and I believe it comes from the old sort of, you know, Robert Winston, what's his, you know, estrogen matters and all of this stuff, where they're basically saying it's like to keep you, well, it's exploded now into back into that sort of, you know, you take it for your face and your nails and your hair, and which, again, I don't have a problem with, right? What I'm saying is, though, is that you also need to understand that each individual, as you've quite rightly said, is if you're not metabolizing that well, estrogen will be stored in tissues. It will be stored somewhere. And, you know, you don't want that recirculating, you know, estrogen. And I don't think people talk about that enough, do you?
I never hear anybody talking about it, even in the, certainly not in the medical profession, but because they don't really use testing that can show that. So I run a test, you've probably come across it, called the Dutch test, which can actually show that. And it will help to see parts of, not the whole picture, but parts of how your body is metabolizing estrogen. And it's a very important test, especially when you're younger, if you're having a lot of symptoms. It's a little bit trickier with perimenopause and menopause because you can't always catch the right time of the month, so you don't know what you're looking at, unless you run like a 30 days, which is a lot more expensive. But also somebody who's had breast cancer or whose family history is breast cancer is very interesting, because one of the pathways is very much more highly linked to breast cancer, for example. So if I was in that position, then I would be looking at that test on a regular basis. But apart from people who run that test, nobody's talking about it. And I don't understand why, because it just makes it's common sense. If you didn't metabolize estrogen well when you were younger, why would you suddenly be able to now? Nothing's like, what has changed? Nothing.
I don't know. Yeah, and I don't know why people don't talk about it. I don't know. I don't know if that's just because social media is so, well, it feels like it's dominated now with, but then because of my own experience, I might be sort of a little bit cognitively blinded, because I believe that that's all that people are talking about. But I do think that it's become the more dominating conversation. Would you agree with that?
I think so. And I think also social media algorithm plays a part in that, because we are in that space, we probably see a lot more of it than most people would. So we're being served with posts that talk about it. But yes, I think the dominant conversation around menopause is certainly more geared towards HRT than anything else. But
and I don't have a problem with HRT, so that's one thing I would make clear. But what I think is,
me neither, and I think it can be very helpful for some people.
So do I, and I think that's absolutely, that should be acknowledged. But I think this kind of almost like this, there's this, like, there's no side effects. It's like, that's the bit that I can't get my head around. It's like
100% safe.
No side effects. What do you mean there's no side effects? There's no risks, there's no side effects, there's no negatives at all about HRT. The only negative is if you don't take it. That's how it's become. I'm like, wait a minute,
where did that
become so skewed that we've lost sense of all reality? I think unfortunately, I think the fallout from this, and I'm not talking about, you know, the sort of just, oh, take HRT. I think there will be a fallout from this. There already is, in terms of, you know, which is why I did Panorama, in terms of womb cancer and in terms of womb hyperplasia, and in terms, you know, there are risks, and you know, if those risks are not really fully understood, then, you know, I mean, I didn't have any informed consent, so there was no risks described to me at all. And I think if you're being led down a road where it's like, no, absolutely, there's no risks, and keep increasing your doses and keep increasing your doses, and do you know what, keep going higher because you need more, I think that is a disaster waiting to happen. And I think it's already starting to happen. We've got more and more women being referred, because I know from gynecology, you know, being referred for bleeding, and you know, and bleeding may be a common occurrence on HRT, but if you haven't looked at the complexities of that individual, you can't turn around and say there's nothing to worry about here.
And I think it's very likely costing the NHS a lot of money, because every case of unexplained bleeding is having to be referred to gynecology, and then procedures are having to be carried out to check that there's no cancer involved. And you know, 9 times out of 10 it's not cancer, and it's just the dosage of estrogen to progesterone was in. They're a balancing act. You can't have one without the other.
So you know, we've got to understand a bit more about how this affects the whole body, rather than it just being the womb, I guess. I don't know. I went on
HRT a few years ago for a period, and I noticed my appetite increased considerably.
Oh right, okay.
Really, my appetite increased, and I just wanted a lot more sweet stuff, and I mean, I definitely gained weight. People say you can't gain weight with HRT. Well, I beg to differ, because I see a lot of it, but and whether that's because whether that's because appetite increases or directly due to the estrogen, you know, I don't know. But we do know that in younger women, estrogen dominance tends to create a much more curvy body. It promotes fat storage. So why would HRT not do the same?
Well, it's like when people say, you know, I've always been a big busted type of, but I'm higher in estrogen, and that's what I trace back from being a teenager. Right?
Oh, my bust got loads bigger when I was on the
so did mine, and so did mine when I was taking it. My bust had got bigger, and you can't. It's a growth hormone. It's a stimulating growth type of hormone. That's not saying that it's bad, but you just need to understand that that's what it does. So you know, if we're not actually understanding what it actually does, it's almost like being sold. I know people are putting it on their face now. I've seen a few people have shared something with me where it's being used as face cream. And, you know, I'm not telling anyone not to use it as face cream. I'm just saying, is there any safety data for that? So if there's no safety data, then you are, you don't know, do you? So if you're prepared to take that risk, because I would not take that risk now. I think I would say, I think I could find a face cream that would be safer, if that makes sense. So why? But it's like we've gone into this kind of like, oh, it's you know, the sort of rub it on everything.
So what would you like to see happen in the menopause space? Not necessarily HRT, but just in the menopause space in general. What would you like to see happen going forwards? What changes would you like to see?
From my own personal point of view, from the work that I've done for my book and the experience that I've had, I think the kind of dominant biomedical model is really, really, really limited. And I think that I'd like to see the conversation broadened out so much more, so that we take in this whole sort of aspect of the, you know, what is perimenopause to menopause, that transition, that dynamic, you know, brain and nervous system calibration, that body calibration. But along with that comes lots of other things like You know, for me, it's like more like post-traumatic growth. You know, what opportunities are there? Instead of it being very much, I'm not negating people's symptoms because I had a really bad time. What I'm trying to say is if we broaden out the conversation, it's more nourishing. At the moment, I'm finding the conversation has become so dominated with, do you take HRT? No. Do you? Yes. And then let's have an argument about it. You know, it's that's how it feels to me. And because that's become so dominant, we're missing out potentially on, you know, celebrating women and understanding our health from a much more biopsychosocial type of lens. Would that make sense?
Yeah, I 100% agree. From my perspective, I want to see a shift back to a focus on the body as a whole rather than just about what your estrogen and progesterone and testosterone are doing. Because ultimately, the way I see it, why do some women go to head into perimenopause, through perimenopause and out the other end with very few side effects when others are really, really bad? And it's multifactorial, but one of the big things is that they come into it. It's how their body comes into it. When you enter perimenopause, your hormones go haywire. And let's not forget, there's an orchestra of hormones. There's not just three, there's an orchestra. Exactly. And what your thyroid is doing and your thyroid hormones and your adrenals and your adrenal hormones and your neurotransmitters on top of that will dictate what happens. And then we hit perimenopause and estrogen, well, progesterone starts to decline first, estrogen starts to go like a crazy bitch. And then we have, you know, testosterone doing whatever it's going to do. And it's for me, it's the straw that breaks the camel's back. So if the camel is already overburdened with imbalances, then you are not going to have the greatest of perimenopause, very likely. Whereas if you come into it in a good place, your body's going to be robust, it's going to be resilient, and it's going to be able to cope much better. Stress is such a massive problem.
That's what my focus is on. It's about inflammation, and it's about understanding that stress and inflammation and toxic stress. You know, I had a lot of my work is around childhood and then moving on, early life stress, adverse childhood experiences, and teenage stress. But again, it's an accumulation of stress, right? Because when you arrive at perimenopause, you've got all of your life chapters, as I said. It's like in menopause, they've sort of opened the middle bit of the book and gone, right, we're at menopause and estrogen. And I'm like, wait a minute, we need to look at the actual previous chapters, because that carried forward those epigenetic changes, that stress, that, you know. And one thing we do know is all diseases, every single one of them is underpinned with stress. All of them, not estrogen deficiency. You know, as much as you want to make out that it's like, oh, you know, estrogen deficiency.
Because we're living longer. It's because women are living longer. That's the one I keep hearing. And I'm like, just doesn't kind of add up.
It doesn't. I mean, stress and the stress response is, you know, my book is around how we're built to survive, and reproduction comes secondary anyway to survival. So I don't know how we've ended up talking over here about reproductive hormones when actually they're secondary to so many other as you said, the thyroid, because, you know, they don't come back in until puberty, you know. So we've kind of got this all a little bit skewed. And actually, it's when we come into perimenopause, and we start to decline production of our sex hormones, the adrenals are supposed to take over. So what happens if your adrenals can't do their job, the survival job, which is then anything non-essential like fertility and reproduction is going to be downregulated. And, you know, producing sex hormones, you don't need them to survive. You can live with very, very low levels of sex hormones. What we're designed to do. I mean, I think that I know that the conversation's moved into, no, we need to boost them back up again to live longer. But if you actually stop to think that, well, there's no evidence for that at all. But secondly, we are programmed biologically to go through menopause and come out the other end in this new life phase. And you are biologically programmed to do that. That, you know, the brain and nervous system and the body is designed to do it. It's not like a fault where all of a sudden we've discovered that, oh, we got this wrong, guys. Evolution has just completely messed it up. And all of a sudden now, you know, it doesn't make sense to me that we then start looking at adding in hormones, which, you know, you've also got with estrogen, there's brain-derived estrogen after menopause. You're still producing enough chemicals, you know, and I'm not sure that, you know, keep pushing them higher. I'm not sure that's the answer, if I'm being honest. I know others would disagree with that, but not from the work that I've done in terms of looking at the science of the brain and the nervous system. You definitely do not want too much excitatory, you know, estrogen and glutamate and adrenaline in your system, do you? It's just more stress.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, you know, there's having enough and not having too much. And the problem
Exactly.
with the problem with replacement hormones, especially starting them earlier and earlier, you know, women in their early 40s who haven't even reached perimenopause being put on it. I've seen that happen because some of their
But
symptoms.
not from surgical. I mean, obviously, when this is the one thing.
Surgical menopause is a completely different thing.
Exactly, completely different. And you know, post-ovarian insufficient, all of that stuff is so different. But you're talking about women that are just biologically aging, because that's what we're referring to. Is that what you're saying, that they're on hormones through the aging
Yes, I've
process?
seen women who have been put on it and it's not actually been really confirmed whether they are truly in perimenopause. And also, you know, we've talked about the fact that estrogen starts to fluctuate. So putting women on lots of estrogen at that early stage. Now, there is an argument for starting on progesterone earlier, especially if, you know, you are deficient in progesterone. And I do not understand why that is not happening more. Why are women not started on this very protective hormone?
Inhibitory hormone, exactly. So it's bringing down inflammation. So this is what my book is about as well, about progesterone and allopregnanolone, GABA. So all of these inhibitory tone, actually, that's what you need. There's a gap, right? And it would be much more beneficial to
bring that one up. Yeah. It's a bizarre thing, and I guess it'll play out as it plays out. But I think it's important for women to, you know, hear different sides so that they can make more informed decisions about what they do with their own body. Because ultimately, it's really important that you make a choice informed, and that often isn't happening. And it's the same with the medical industry in general. A lot of times medications are given out and there isn't informed consent because there's no information. It's just I
think that's a really key thing. That's one of the things that I've been campaigning for, is the issue of informed consent, because, you know, I had no idea. And I think we're now getting more and more. I'm not sure that we've kind of tipped the other way now, which is like, there's so much information about HRT, but unfortunately so much of it is false. I think we need to be more honest about the side effects of HRT, and that there can be side effects. As much as there can be benefits, there can also be this over here. Because once you start to understand that more, if you do decide to take it and it doesn't pan out, you don't then feel like, oh, well, there's something wrong with me. It's a very, I say this in my book, it's a very, very, very difficult thing to get right. It's a moving target. So it's more like a scientific art form to get it right, whereas it's being sold as, hey, slap it on and off you go.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. Well, it's been great chatting with you, Paula. Tell everybody the name of your book, if you've got the title, and where they can get hold of it, or when they can get hold of it.
So the best place to find me is at Mrs. Paula Rastrick on Instagram, or I'm on LinkedIn as well. And I've got a newsletter. And if you go to my website, which has just been done, actually Instagram's got some new resources on there. So you can go over there and you can kind of tap into my link in my bio. And it's got some new resources about HRT side effects. It's got a video on there about that.
Great. Lovely. Well, thank you very much. I'm sure people will find this very interesting and useful. And it's good to hear different opinions, different sides to this hot topic, and we'll see what happens. All right.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.